those of us who come from a monolingual English-speaking background, language doesn't form a very conscious part of our identity. We don't think about the fact that we speak English or a variety of English very often. But for many people in the world, language is a very important part of their view of who they are. There are many multilingual communities around the world where 3 or more languages are spoken by most people. In that situation, a person's primary language is a defining element of their personal identity and how others view them. People have strong feelings about language, which is why there are numerous political battles involving language around the world. In many regions, smaller language groups are being absorbed by larger languages or cultures around them. Some people groups, such as the Maori in New Zealand, have made an intense and very effective effort to make their language relevant and significant to younger generations, both of Maori and non-Maori New Zealanders, because they see it as a key part of their identity as a people. Our goal here is to discuss only some of the issues involved in the relationship between language and identity. It's a huge subject and one that many books have been written about. We will simply introduce some of the main ideas about the place that language has in the identity of a group and how it relates to other parts of their identity, such as their ethnic group, nation, history, culture, and religion. Thinking about language and identity should improve our view of who we are in our eyes and in other people's, and it should also deepen our understanding of social interaction. One way identity is sometimes defined is by categorising people according to various criteria: ethnic origin, language, national origin, and so forth. But we're going to look at it from the point of view of how people view themselves, and particularly how their language relates to the view they have of themselves. Most definitions of identity agree that it is something like an individual person feeling that they're part of a group. That feeling is based on them sharing certain values with others in the group and finding a sense of belonging there. Self-identification commonly involves identifying with a specific group or community based on a range of criteria: racial, ethnic, cultural, social, and so forth. Self-identification necessarily involves imposing boundaries between groups and emphasising one's belonging to one group rather than another. Belonging to one group usually entails exclusion from another. Self-identification also commonly involves emphasising sameness or similarities between the individual and the group he self-identifies with on the one hand, and emphasising the differences with the other groups. Some other descriptions that might help us to form a picture of what identity is that a person recognises himself as a member of one or more groups. The person shares values and meanings associated with a group. A person recognises characteristics that they have in common with other members. The person distinguishes himself from other people who do not share the group characteristics. Other members of the group recognise him as a member, and a group must see itself and also be seen by other groups and individuals as a distinct social entity. Some characteristics of the group may be thought of as more important than others, core values or qualities. And important characteristics or core values can differ depending on the situation. A characteristic becomes important if it can be seen as making a certain group distinct from other groups. Skin colour can be important in a multiracial society, while language can be an important feature in a multi-ethnic and multicultural society. In Western global cultures, the relationship between individual identity and group identity is very complex and diverse. A person's deep personal identity is made up mostly by the various group identities that they also have. So, someone who identifies himself as an Australian may have an individual identity that includes being from a family of Chinese ethnic origin, belonging to the medical profession, being part of a local Chinese-speaking church, being able to speak 2 or more languages, and belonging to a group that plays guitar on the weekends. There would be many other people who identify as Australians who do not share many or even any specific aspects of his individual identity with him. So is Australianness a meaningful identity? In a broad and complex global culture, group identity is a very abstract concept, but it's very interesting to note that people still display a strong need to self-identify with a particular group. It would appear logical that in the increasingly globalised world we live in, with its ever-increasing levels of communication and with the decreasing importance of state and geographical boundaries, this need for identifying with a particular group or place will gradually grow weaker. As it turns out, the opposite seems to be the case. It seems that with the disappearance of borders and boundaries and geographical distances, this need for identity grows stronger, and with the diminished significance of boundaries, individuals look for other salient features that will help them establish a sense of belonging to a particular group. And in this, language continues to play a huge role. There are also many people groups in the world who are not greatly connected to the wider global culture and who consequently have a much more concrete group identity, which is tied in a large way to the unique languages they speak. They often have a cohesive view of who they are as a people group, and as individuals they find a much greater sense of belonging in their ethno-linguistic identity. For example, a person who calls himself an Arta person, which is a people group in Papua New Guinea, would share a great number of individual identities with any other person who also calls themselves Arta. But even for these types of people groups, in today's world there are often pressures from outside that have the potential to threaten or confuse their sense of identity, or in some cases to change it completely. Sometimes these are positive influences and sometimes not, but no matter how it turns out, the process of change in identity as a people group is often a stressful and challenging one. Anyone who writes about identity points out that while there are many aspects of a person's identity and many factors that can determine a person's identity, like ethnic, social or racial origin, culture, religion, education, professional occupation, family background and so forth, language is probably the most powerful instrument for constructing and expressing identity. People who speak the same heart language obviously have a much greater degree of shared common ground, common understanding, and have the ability to develop a deeper relationship. So it follows that shared language is a primary way that people identify with others. It is also a primary separating force between different groups. Even within the same language community, we still use language to further identify a person. When we listen to someone speaking, we're unconsciously evaluating and trying to identify who they are. Do they have an accent? Are they from the city or the country? Are they well educated? Do they use certain words and not others? Speech is a very powerful factor in this identification process. When someone is talking, we are making social, cultural and ethnic categorizations and value judgments based on their linguistic behavior. All of the levels of language, phonology, syntax, semantics and pragmatics, affect our beliefs about and our evaluation of the speaker. We use language to exchange meaningful and sometimes very complex and subtle messages with other members of the same linguistic community, but we are also using language to tell the rest of the world about ourselves, to mark ourselves as similar to or different from other individuals, to show which group we belong to or which we would like to belong to. Speakers often make adjustments to their speech depending on who it is they're talking to. Two of these types of adjustments are convergence and divergence. So convergence is when speakers modify their speech in a way to make it more similar to the speech of the person they're speaking to, and this is the most common type of adjustment. Divergence is when speakers make their speech dissimilar from the speech of the addressee. People use convergence to show solidarity and similarity with the person they're speaking to, which is based on a universal desire for approval. Divergence is much less common. An example might be an English middle-class Oxford graduate emphasising his Oxford accent when communicating with a speaker from a lower socioeconomic status. The factors which influence convergence or divergence are all about identity. People adjust their speech either because the participants in the conversation regard themselves as members of the same group, or one participant would like to be regarded as a member of the social group of the second participant, or perhaps the two participants represent groups which are in conflict. In multilingual communities, one language group is usually politically and economically the dominant one, and there are one or more subordinate groups. The dominant language may be the lingua franca, the language of business and trade. It may even be an official language of the country, or it is the one that the educated people speak. So, in terms of linguistic behaviour, the most typical pattern of speech adjustment is convergence from the minority language group to the dominant language group. For example, a Papua New Guinean who probably speaks 3 or 4 languages will use the most flawless English he's capable of with foreign English speakers, even if they both speak Tok Pisin, a PNG trade language, well. This is not surprising, given that there are often real advantages in terms of power and/or living standards if people acquire a high level of competence in a second, more dominant language, one that is used in higher education, government offices and in businesses. Many of those involved in minority language development projects, so developing alphabets and written materials, in translation work or literacy program development, find that their first task is to motivate and encourage minority language speakers to value their language, and that it's a positive thing for them to have books in their language and for them to learn to read and use their own language in new ways and for different reasons. It's not always the case that a minority language is undervalued, though. Language is sometimes used as a powerful force to assert nationalism, such as with the Basque minority, which strongly encourages all its members to learn and use the ethnic language of the Basque community to raise nationalistic self-awareness. A number of prominent historians, sociologists and political scientists have argued that the existence of a national language is the primary foundation upon which a national identity is built. But national identity is complex because of the politics involved. So to take the example of the British Isles, for centuries their linguistic pattern was a patchwork of local dialects, Germanic or Celtic in origin. Only in modern times did individuals, motivated by nationalistic ambitions of various kinds, set about to establish languages for the nations of England, Ireland, Scotland and Wales, as well as for Cornwall and other smaller regions, which often constitute nations in the eyes of their most fervent partisans. In the case of Scotland, 2 separate national languages emerged, Gaelic and Scots, and partisans of the 2 languages have focused much of their energies on combating the rival claims of the other, rather than arguing against the wide use of English. The vast majority of Scots consider the strategic economic value of using a world language such as English as greatly outweighing the political, cultural, and sentimental value of the heritage languages. The struggle between Gaelic and Scots continues, but English is the accepted dominant language. Ethnic identity is sometimes used as a synonym of national identity, but it's helpful to make a distinction. Ethnic identity is focused more on common descent, common ancestors and a common history, and on a cultural heritage shared because of common descent, rather than on political factors like borders, currencies and governments. National identity is focused on political borders and autonomy from other nations. There are many people groups in the world today who share an ethnic identity, but who geographically live across the borders of different nations. This situation is quite common in the world today, particularly in Asia and Africa. In Southeast Asia, many groups who are part of one ethnic people group live in several different nations. Many of these people may also speak the dominant language of the nations in which they live, but their primary identity would be with their people group in which they share a heart language and cultural heritage. This chart describes the distribution of the people who would identify themselves as Lahu people, who all speak the Lahu language, but live in 5 different nations just in Southeast Asia. These girls pictured here are Lahu girls who live in the USA. Many ethnic people groups are even more widely distributed, such as the Hmong Noir. as you can see here. Language, or a part of language, such as an alphabet, can also be a marker or symbol of religious identity. Now, when I'm referring to Christianity here, it's an official religion, not necessarily the true church. Christian Europe used Latin, the Islamic world uses Arabic, and the Jewish people use Hebrew, all because of their religious identity. When Christianity underwent an East-West split, the use of Latin as opposed to Greek became its most potent symbol. The groups of Christians within the Western Asian lands ruled by Muslims identified themselves by the languages of Syriac, Chaldean, and other languages. Jewish communities living in Europe used Hebrew loanwords which distinguished their speech from that of other German and Spanish speakers. Religious splits in Islam came to be associated with dialectal differences in Arabic. Language was often thought of or used to reinforce the difference between one religious group and another. Members of the various religious groups needed and wanted to be able to recognise one another and to identify members of other groups. Language was and continues to be an important part of religious identity. Language is such an important part of identity that even the alphabet people use can become a controversial and divisive issue. This is because the preference of one alphabet over another is often tied to a religious or social identity or tradition. Countries who choose the Arabic alphabet often do so because it expresses an ideology. It is natural that the alphabet in which the Quran was written should become an integral part of a vision of the world, an external manifestation of belonging to the Ummah, the Islamic community. Countries opting for it would thereby declare their Islamic identity, and its use would amount accordingly to a form of confession of faith. In China, where unity is a key issue in such a large and diverse country, the Chinese script has been seen for generations as a unifying force. This same script is used for many separate spoken languages or dialects. Orthographic battles are common in situations where identity and nationhood are under negotiation. This is because orthographic systems cannot be conceptualized simply as reducing speech to writing, but rather are symbols that carry historical, cultural, and politicized meanings. There are many other examples that illustrate the fact that language and identity are inseparable, too many to cover in this tutorial. For example, in quite a few places, the language used for street signs has been the cause of conflict or even violence. Many countries have officially recognised languages or language laws relating to the language of education and government, but these decisions are not easy to make. Among the other language speakers of India, the decision to choose Hindi as the official language was seen as an attempt to erase their cultures, and today there are 18 official Indian languages. But the controversy continues because some languages have a higher status or profile than others.